Hi, everybody. Well, if you're here to learn about the most important linguistic issues to correct in software text before it's localized and why it's important to do so, then you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about how to turn garbage in, garbage out into quality in, quality out for software interface text in particular, but maybe other kinds of text as well. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right, so hello, how do you do? I don't know what you do, but hopefully there's kind of a varied audience here, and I hope that this information is useful to you in the role that you might play. I'll just briefly talk a little about me. I lived overseas and I taught English as a second language for about 12 years, and along the way I learned something that I didn't know before, which is that language is fascinating. And I learned a little bit of Thai, some Turkish, some Japanese, some Hawaiian Creole along the way, and I really enjoyed it. And so when I moved back to the United States, I was lucky enough to earn a job at SAS Institute, which makes really complex analytic software for governments, large companies in various industries all around the world. And because I had this interest in languages, I was able over time to build a kind of a niche role for myself as a global English editor, first for documentation and later on for what I do now, which is reviewing software text. Okay. So the topics today, I'll discuss a bit about what global English is and why you might be interested in it. And I'll talk about the business case for doing global English reviews. And I will very briefly go over the top 5 global English guidelines for UI text. The reason I got into this, by the way, is because along the road, as I got more involved with global English, I started looking for UX guidelines on user interface text online, and I really couldn't find anything terribly useful. It was mostly really kind of obvious things for any kind of documentation. Issues like don't write sentences that are too long, stick to simple grammar, don't use complex terminology, and so forth. But I realized later on, working with translators, translation teams, that UI text is really a very different animal from documentation, and that there needs to be guidelines that specifically address the kinds of issues that come up in UI text. So what's a global English review? Basically, I look at all of the user-facing text that appears in a software product, including titles for windows and dialog boxes and such, labels for fields, buttons, and all of that, and all kinds of messages, error messages, informational messages, and also log messages. I think they should be clear also. And occasionally I look at embedded user assistance, but the writers do most of that along with the tooltips. So at my company, we have dozens of UX designers and dozens of doc writers, and I offer global English training to them team by team. But I found that to learn it, you have to do it. And writers and UX designers, by and large, at my company anyway, are monolingual, and they don't really have much of an understanding of linguistic differences between languages. So it's a learning process that happens in the course of doing global English review with me. So in my presentations, so the roles that we have are the UX designers who write the specs and the text for the labels. The developers then code the text, but they also write the error and the informational messages. The translators do the best they can, trying to translate the texts that they get out of context in their translation tools. And it's not always easy for them to do. So my job that I stepped into was as global English reviewer. I look at and edit the UI text with guidance from the developers, and I work also with tech writers and UX specialists whenever I can. So that's my role. I'm a global English specialist. I like to start a training session with my folks at SAS by showing an interface that has all the text removed to underscore the fact that text is actually a lot more important as a part of the user interface than might be imagined. We spend a lot of time making sure that the user interface is pretty and that the icons and the labels all follow our standards and that they're fairly intuitive. But until recently, there really wasn't anybody who was looking at all of the text in our interfaces as opposed to just doing a spotty check on things that came up and reporting issues that happen to come up when you're using the product. I made up this term devspeak to explain the particular style of writing and speakers that developers use among themselves in their dev world. And devspeak is kind of like a dialect or a register of English, a bit like a Creole, and it's hard for people outside the dev world to understand devspeak. They tend to leave words out, they leave out articles, and they also repurpose words using verbs as nouns, nouns as verbs, things like that. But mainly it's often very short, which was good in the past, in the day of punch cards when memory storage was a lot more expensive than it is now. But brief is not always best. So basically, I'm a translator. I don't actually do translations with the translation division, but I translate devspeak into clear standard English for everyone, for our users and for our colleagues and everybody who has to look at it. So have a look at this. Why do we expect our users to understand messages like these? Even if they have some visual context for them, which sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Some of these messages are really ambiguous and would be very difficult to translate and can be difficult to explain, as I've found by working with developers. They certainly wouldn't work for the most part if you plug them into Google Translate, which I have heard our customers sometimes do. If English is not their native language and they come across a message they don't understand, they'll try to plug it into Google Translate and see if it makes it any clearer. But I don't think that Google Translate would do such a great job with this or with this. Invalid input JSON. These are just not as clear as they could be. Here's another message that actually went out to customers. Read that for a second and tell me if you can figure out what is meant. Yeah, me neither. Kind of inscrutable. If you spend enough time with it, you might make a guess, but your guess might be wrong. So the point is that when I edit a properties file which contains our messages, something like 70 to 90% of all the strings need to be revised grammatically or to make them clearer and unambiguous. And if our users are looking at this UI text and regularly wondering, what does this mean, wrinkling their brows and trying to figure out what they should do or what this message means, that can make a poor impression of the quality of our product. Because if they're seeing all of these issues, they have a good reason to wonder why this product that they spent many thousands of dollars for doesn't seem to have much quality control, at least in the language department. But also, poor UI text can make our software harder to use. It's already complicated. We don't need to make it more complicated than it is. So I try to make the software easier to use by improving the text. So in the course of my work trying to propose and get acceptance among managers for global English reviews, I started working with translators and they became very excited because I was addressing directly their pains, having to deal with the garbage that was coming in and not being able to understand what these things meant. So I started working with a terminologist that works in our European localization office. He was interested in figuring out how translators tended to respond or how they got information from the developers and how they cleaned up strings themselves when they were confusing, how they managed to translate them. I was more interested in what caused the query to begin with. What was it? What kind of linguistic issue were the translators struggling with? And I wanted to be able to categorize those so that I could directly address these issues with guidelines. So our translators, when they have a question for the developers, they will open a ticket, and this is an internal tool, and they would send it to the developers and try to get an answer to their question. So for some of these, you'd have to open the ticket to see what the issue was, but the ones that I marked with a red dot, I think you can look at them and see that they would create translation problems, like max view terms. That could mean several different things. This one is a problem. Placeholders cause problems for reasons I'm going to discuss a little later. Unable to create rules config cast table. it could be better. So I started categorizing these with my colleague. And after researching these, we would find out things like, well, a lot of the strings that they were asking questions about aren't even used anymore. So they need to be removed from the properties files because we're translating them for nothing. Sometimes the developer would clarify the meaning, and so the translators would translate into a nice, meaningful string, but hey, the English was bad and it was left bad. So that bothered me. Anyway, so I started categorizing the linguistic issues that I was seeing, and I realized that pretty much all of the queries could be categorized into these top five global English issues. The first three are especially problems linguistically for translation. The other two are big bucket items that really we should be paying attention to anyway, because they relate to other kinds of documentation and so forth. But I'm going to go very quickly through these top five global English issues. The first one is to avoid telegram speech. Okay, and if you don't know what punch cards are in the olden days, then you probably don't know what telegrams are either. It's from a bygone era. So the first global English issue is to avoid this telegram speech. I asked developers to please go back to their 7th grade grammar classes, or in the case of our developers in India, they had lots of English grammar that they learned when they were in school. Their English skills are really good. So I asked them to think back, what is a grammatically correct sentence, and to please try to write that way. And I also remind them that we are moving more and more towards machine translation at SAS, and so we really should be writing our messages in a way that can be handled by machine translation. None of these would work very well with machine translation, and they also wouldn't work with our controlled authoring tools for a number of reasons. Okay. All right, so looking at these, undo transaction blah fail, it's just not grammatical. What they really meant was the undo operation could not be completed for the transaction named this. And I put this in double quotation marks because it's a name. So not to go into a big detail, but that's the old-fashioned way of indicating that something is a name or it's not a literal concept before the age of boldface and italics and other ways of formatting. This is how it was done on a typewriter, another unknown technology today. Project creation failed with something. This has several problems, but the main thing is it's a segmentation issue because the translation tools will break this apart from whatever follows it. And so if they don't have an object to the preposition, then this preposition will be different in some languages depending on what follows. And this one was not very clear. I revised it to say the start value for the horizon could not be determined. Again, this is a word, use it as a word. It can be translated, but it's the name of the value. So we put it in double quotation marks. The second global English issue is to clarify this substitution text. So if y'all are not involved with software so much, you might not know what this is, but at runtime, this little doohickey here will plug in the text, any number of texts that are generated during the process of using the software. Okay? So it's called a placeholder or substitution text. This string seems so simple, new something, but the word new can't be translated into many languages if the translators don't know what is in this substitution parameter, okay? So in this case, it turns out that this could be either limit, limits, report, or reports. And in French, the word new has 4 different forms depending on which one of those it is, okay? So, and I understand that in Hindi there's a similar linguistic issue. So you wouldn't normally think that this would be a problem, but that's the problem with having translatable text in substitution. You shouldn't do that. It's only for names of things and numbers, untranslatable things. So that's a problem. There are other problems with substitution text, but I don't have time to go into it, I'm afraid. The third big linguistic category that causes a lot of localization queries is noun phrases. The translators need to know which part of a phrase is the main noun, the head noun, and which parts are modifying that head noun. So in this case, the head noun could be column name, so you want a new column name, but it could also be the name of a new column. name for the new column. And that would be translated differently in some languages depending on what it means. So a savvy translator is going to ask for clarification. This one is even harder because there's 4 words in it. I've come across as many as 7-word noun phrases because we can do that in English, but you can't do that in other languages. So again, what's the head noun? Is there this thing called a model group and it's a map for that used for evaluation? Or is it a group map for an evaluation model? It's hard to say. So they would have to ask the developer to, as I say, unpack the noun phrase. And I would revise this to make it more clear, basically. All right. I got stuck here, apparently. There you go. The 4th global English issue is a big bucket. Number 4 and 5 are big buckets. Again, these are things that you should be paying attention to for any kind of text. Use standard, unambiguous terminology and grammatical usage. So this might be standard in English, but it doesn't work in any other language. There's no other language that has an S plural form. So they don't know what to do with this. The translators, I'm not sure what to do with such a thing. And slashes also present problems, not only for and or, which is a hard concept to translate, but in many other cases where we use a slash to indicate alternatives. Other languages don't do that, so they have to find a way. In this case, what this meant was update locks, delete overrides, or both. I just used the plural. It covers everything. This one is interesting because it looks simple and straightforward and would be correct, except that the translators need to know, is this a verb or is it an adjective that modifies model? Are they saying duplicate the model or is it a duplicate model? So it could be either of these 2 strings depending on what the answer is. So I would clarify it in one of those 2 ways. Next slide, please. Speaking of terminology, this is a tricky one. One of our consultants who works with the product and is familiar with it had a laugh with one of our translators when he pointed out that the term rolling container translated into his language, which I think was Danish, to sort of envision this scenario, this container that rolls, or it could be a barrel that's rolled along the ground, maybe in a shipping warehouse or something like that. But metaphors don't translate very well, so we have to be really careful about using metaphorical terms and constructions in our UI text. And if we do, then we have to make sure that we find a way to explain it to the translator. Same thing for Java beans or just beans. I came across the term bean by itself, and we don't want to translate it into legume because that would be incorrect. So we have to be thinking all the time about metaphors and whether they're going to present a problem in translation. The last big bucket is correct spelling, capitalization, and grammar. Obviously, I mean, it seems obvious, but as we all know, in devspeak, there's a lot of shortcuts and sort of interesting internal ways of expressing concepts and error messages that simply don't work for anybody who's not an insider. And sometimes it doesn't even work for the insiders. Sometimes developers tell me they don't know what they meant when they wrote a string that they wrote a year ago. They don't know what it means. They have to look it up in the code to figure out what it means. So in this case, they're using open, which is a syntax element. They're using it as a noun, project open, opening of the project or something, but this is a syntax element. It shouldn't be used in a string like this. What it actually means is that the project could not be opened because the process timed out. Let's just use standard English. This one, camel-cased words, cause huge problems for translation because they're really not translatable. Traffic source in this case is the name of a parameter. Now, the translators will sometimes ask the developer, can we split this and add a space and translate it? And sometimes the developer will say yes. Sure, but is that the correct answer? Because if it's an end user looking at this message and they're not looking at the actual code, they might not know what that is. Unless there's something in the actual user interface that contains the words traffic source like this, it's not going to make sense to them. So it means one of these 2 things, either specify the traffic source or specify a traffic source parameter, and the translators will know not to translate this as long as they have the noun. They need the noun. to indicate what the camel case word refers to. So that's a biggie. The bottom line to all this is translation queries, asking them, waiting for an answer, guessing at an answer if they don't get a response, that costs time and money, and it also can cause a very poor user experience because bad source text means a bad user experience. And as I continually point out to people, I got into this through working with my colleagues in localization because the business case there was clear. It's a little harder to prove the business case of clear text for users because people tend to assume that our users are super savvy and they understand the sort of gobbledygook that shows up in messages. And we all know what that looks like, no matter what product you're using. Well, lots of products that you're using, whether they're iPhone apps or whatever, you can see that there wasn't much time spent on the UI text. And it's kind of annoying. But when it confuses even native speakers, then that's a problem. And I run across UI text all the time that would be confusing to native speakers as well as to non-native speakers. And I also like to remind people that, well, at my company, being a global company, probably about half of all of the users of SaaS software, whether they're system admins or end users, are not native speakers of English. They might be using English language software because if they're from Thailand or Uzbekistan, probably the software doesn't get translated into their language unless there's a business case for that. So they have to use the English user interface. And so we have to be thinking about them too. We have to be clear for everyone. Clear text is good for everyone, and it's good for business. That's the bottom line. So before I go, I want to refer you to this book that was written by my friend John Cole. He was a colleague of mine for many years at SAS. He's retired now, but he wrote this book, and as far as I know, it is the only one like it. It goes into great detail about writing clear and translatable text for documentation, not for UI text so much, because again, UI text is a different animal. But this is a very useful resource for your writers to have and for UX designers to have so that they can be thinking about how to write clear text for a global market and also for controlled authoring software. Okay, so that book is available on Amazon. And that's all I have to cover today. So I'm not sure how much time I just took, but if there's any time left, then I'll be happy to take questions. And if you would like to send me questions or if you'd like to share your story about your experience with editing UI text or similar, then I invite you to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. So I'm going to stop sharing for now. And I'll hang out in case we have any time we want to ask questions, but if not, then I thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great day, and please stay safe, and don't get COVID. Take care.